Wearing with the glasses. Yeah.
My question is for you, David. So you mentioned that the first letter of the sentences weren't capitalized, and I gotta admit, for the first chapter, that really annoyed me. But by the end, I started liking it. So I actually have two questions for you. Joking question. How did the spell check on that not annoy you? An actual question, was that like a conscious choice, and why, or was it just your shift key was broken?
I was about to ask, how could it not be a self-conscious choice? So the question for you in the back was about the lowercase, and the reason that I decided my will was lowercase was it's all about his own self-perception. That there are two key things about my will's self-perception. I mean, the first is that he really sees himself or expression as being entirely related to being on the computer. I know this will shock you, but some people, when they're IMing or emailing, they don't use capital letters. I know nobody has. And not just teenagers, believe me. Like, I get professional emails from 60-year-olds who suddenly have lost their capital letters. But I've always been fascinated by that, by what is it about the technology that makes us go lowercase? And I felt that Will would see his true self as being who he is when he communicates, especially by way of I am. But also I think there is a really interesting psychological part of that of thinking of yourself as a lowercase person and what that means. And I think my Will absolutely finds himself or thinks of himself as a lowercase person. And not in a rebellious, E. Cummings, I am going to fight against language. More like the voices in my head are speaking lowercase. And so that was the reason I chose it. It was helpful because it did delineate my will from John's will on the page, but that wasn't the reason I did it. The reason was, literally when I started writing in this Will's voice, I thought that he was lowercase. So it's interesting. Most people at first, even if they IM and email all the time in lowercase, to find that in a book, they get freaked out. And some people think that there's no punctuation. There's totally punctuation. It's like at first it's jarring, but yeah, you totally get used to it, just as the way we've all gotten used to it with IMs and emails.
I don't want to make a mistake. Yes.
Right here?
Yes.
You guys say that you wrote your books separately and then you brought them together. There must have been a point when you came together and you realized you were writing two completely different things. So how much of the original is left after you guys collaborated?
Well, I mean, we got together after each chapter. You know, it's not like I wrote a whole book. And I was like, hey, is this okay, like your book? So, you know, even though I didn't have David's text to refer to and David didn't have my text to refer to, I'd read him the last chapter that I'd written and he'd read me the last chapter that he'd written before we went off. So David's, in the same way that any text is after I encounter it, or any story is, David's themes were in my mind, and I hope that I think that my themes were in your mind, and so that alone kind of connected it. We spent a lot of time in revision trying to make it seamless. Look like one novel instead of like two novels with a middle that happens in the same place. Well, my prediction for the World Cup, I don't know, like England-US final maybe. David actually can sing, but he didn't. You can sing.
Very nice. Sing one.
Maybe. Patience, grasshopper.
Alright, next question.
This is my turn? Person I missed before.
Okay. This is about the writing process for both of you. Do you guys, when you're at home writing your own stories, not collaborating, do you write, regardless of if you think it's crap or whatever, and then you go back and perfect and make beautiful P.S. John, I'm madly in literary love with you. I would totally have your paper baby. I'm married. You're married, but I'd have your paper baby. But I'm curious, like, are you guys, you know, do you write crap, and then revise? Like, how do you... Because I'm writing and I can't get to the end. How do you get to the end?
Very different answers to that question. Do you want to go first? All right, Kurt Vonnegut used to say there's two kinds of people. There's like people who like do it as they go, and there's people who like hack away at manuscripts years later. I am the latter kind of person. Like I write a draft of a book. Every book I've ever written, except for Will Grayson, I write a whole draft of the book, and then I delete almost all of it, like at least 80% of it. So if I write like 80,000 words, I maybe am left with 10 or 20,000 words after the revision starts. And then I'll start again and again and again and again and again, and that's kind of why it takes me so long. But that's also the only thing about writing I really enjoy. So I really revel in that, and I would not want to lose it, not because I think it's the most efficient way or because I think my way is good or it works or whatever, but just because it gives me pleasure, which is important in writing, I think.
Right.
So that's the way I do it, and David is the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, partially because I don't have much writing time in my life. Like, basically, when I sit down, and because I'm an editor, and I think sort of my brain is wired to be an editor, I think that I sit down, and usually what comes out is what's in the book. I mean, certainly there's editing, and certainly there's revision, but for the most part, I think about it so much that when I actually sit down to write, it's usually pretty much there. And I will keep going back. I'm the type of writer who I will start, and then as I'm writing, I will keep going back to page 1 and read it over and revise to the point where I've left off, and then keep going. So usually my first chapters are really polished, and at the end I just sort of push right through, and that's really raw. And if you read my books, you can sort of notice that a lot happens at the end really quickly because I'm just in the zone. But that's just the way. I mean, again, I think people are wired in different ways, but for me, that's the way I do it. And I firmly believe in it. As an editor, I've seen authors who've done it every single possible way, and I don't think there is a right way or a wrong way. It's just the right way for you or the wrong way for you.
How long did it take both of you to write your first book?
My first book took 5 years.
Really?
But I had a job, you know, I was writing at night and on the weekends. It took me about 3 years to sell it, and then about 2 years after I sold it to revise it.
And in fairness, I mean, I did the best thing you can do for a first novel. I actually tricked myself because I thought I was writing a short story, and it just got longer and longer and longer. So it took a year, but it was only about halfway through that I realized I was writing a novel. So trick yourself.